Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 10 o'clock briefing today, Conserving Species and Ecosystems Through Better Technology. We have 3 speakers on our briefing today. They are Martin Wikelski, Managing Director of the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, Bistra Dilkina, Assistant Professor of Computer Science at the University of Associate Director for the Center for AI and Society, and Dan Morris, a Principal Scientist at Microsoft AI for Earth in Redmond, Washington. So we will hear brief remarks from each of our speakers, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. I'm the director of the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. As you all know, biodiversity is in a big crisis right now, globally, and we have to take measures on a global scale to really prevent the further demise of animals. Now, the only way to do that is if we really understand where animals live and die, and to know immediately when they die, because then we can prevent further death and really preserve them. Now, we have established or are establishing a global new observation system. We're basically giving animals little wearables that they carry around their entire life. And that tells us their health status, their location, and how they interact with other animals. And that gives us the idea of where they are living, where they can live, what they need to live, and also where they are dying. Now, this is really important for us because humans can learn a lot from animals. We now understand that the sixth sense of animals, that is sort of what people always thought as sort of this anecdotal knowledge that animals have, is actually based upon the collective behavior of animals, the swarm intelligence. And this is an emergent property that you get when you link intelligent sensors together. This is something that everybody knows from your cell phones. You know, you look and you have Google traffic, for example, telling you how long you take to work. The same is what we now get from animals. The interaction of these animals that are globally able to communicate with us gives us a sense of information on what life is all about. And this is what we now call the Internet of Animals. And again, this is mainly to give animals a voice on the planet, to show humans how important the knowledge from animal is, and allowing us to conserve them. Oh, forgot the visuals. Really the emergent property of an intelligent sensing system. So if you have the most intelligent sensors that we have on the planet, animals, and link them together, then you can really learn how they see the environment, how they sense the environment through the eyes and ears and the noses of many. And that's really how we can learn about these, or potentially learn about these unknown phenomena or unpredicted phenomena so far. Make that a little faster. So these are the little sensors. These are global satellite telemetry devices. And this is how this is implemented in a prediction system at Mount Etna at a volcanic eruption monitoring center.
Hi everybody. So yeah, I'm Bistra Dilkina, an assistant professor at USC, and most of my work is in artificial intelligence, developing both machine learning and scalable optimization algorithms. But most of my work focuses on using those techniques for biodiversity conservation. As most of you know, the crisis in biodiversity is significant, and a lot of the actions, conservation actions that we need to take have to be implemented with extremely limited resources. And so it becomes very important to have the right tools to make us to be able to have the largest environmental impact within the limited resources that we have that are provided by governments and agencies and NGOs and so on. And so in my work, we have basically shown that specifically when we are trying to plan for conserving land for landscape connectivity, which is basically a very important ecosystem service that you want core habitat areas to actually have ways of the animals to move between them in order to be resilient to disasters, to curb down inbreeding and so on. And so how do we decide which areas we should build overpasses over in order to be able to provide that connectivity or conserve whole corridors? And so by using the appropriate computational algorithms which allow for considering both the ecological needs as well as the economic costs, we are able to provide decision makers with the tools that they can make such optimized plans. In particular, we show that if you only look at the ecological impacts and make recommendations based on just the best possible in terms of the biodiversity, and only after the fact evaluate how much it would cost, you might recommend things that are 10 times more expensive than the cheapest way you could do it. Maybe you don't want the cheapest because it might be like too environmentally degraded, but with the algorithms, we can actually find intermediate solutions where with a small increase in budget, you can actually find very good ecological corridors. And so one of the big things we're trying to do is really show the fact that you need to have this economic and ecological considerations put together and have the computational algorithms that can support that reasoning. And so the other thing that we've been working at my lab is a collaboration with Microsoft AI for Earth, where we are developing machine learning algorithms that are able to take satellite imagery and produce really, really fine-scale land cover maps. And how is that relevant to conservation? Well, when you're able to actually do this land cover mapping at a resolution of like 1 meter, a square meter, or even lower, then you can actually really help agencies to make conservation actions, such as identifying riparian buffers, where there's like a forest next to rivers that might be good for conservation, or identify, for example, illegal plantations in the middle of a conserved forest in Indonesia. So we are currently working, although this tool was developed with data from the US, where we had this fine resolution data for a limited part of Maryland. Now we are trying to develop the methodologies that will allow NGOs and other agencies around the world to be able, with limited human effort, fine-tune this tool to work for their particular geography by basically developing the appropriate AI algorithms for that. And finally, there's also a lot of potential for AI to help another aspect of the biodiversity crisis, which is illegal poaching and wildlife trafficking. I don't know how many of you are aware, but actually illegal wildlife trafficking is a huge illicit supply chain worth between $5 and $23 million. And it has a lot of potential harms by basically congregating together with more other illicit supply chains. It harms biodiversity as well as economic well-being. And so we have been using AI in order to help this in two aspects. One is actually stopping poaching within the conservation areas where rangers are actually patrolling in order to protect the animals, such as elephants and other endangered species that might live in the protected area, and yet poachers enter and put traps and kill them. And so we have actually a lot of historic data from these ranger patrols, and we can use that historic data to build machine learning models that are now helping parks be able to more accurately target where the rangers would go in order to increase their efficiency. And similarly, that's only on the actual conservation area. That's like where it starts, right, where the animals get poached. But the whole wildlife trafficking problem is on a much bigger scale. Where do they go next? Which ports do they use to transport them? Right? Which markets do they get sold on? Which restaurants are they offered on the menu on? So this is also the other aspect that we are trying to address now, is actually studying the overall wildlife trafficking supply chain and develop methodologies that will allow us to interdict it, to reduce its resilience in order to make it less effective and hopefully reduce the harm that it's doing.
Hey everyone, I'm Dan Morris. I run a program at Microsoft called AI for Earth. So both of the previous speakers have highlighted that biodiversity is in catastrophic decline across the globe. I bet that didn't surprise everybody in this room. How do we actually know that, though? We know that because we depend on a small army of chronically underfunded ecology teams to both monitor and manage wildlife populations and critical ecosystems. And right now, those people spend an egregious amount of their time turning raw data from remote sensors into actionable information that's actually useful for conservation. So for example, while we're sitting here in this room, there are thousands of wildlife ecologists all across the world clicking one by one on millions and millions of pictures of animals to find out what's where. So when we hear that some particular species is in decline, in large part we know that because somebody had to go and click on all those images. And similarly, there are thousands of landscape ecologists all across the world, while we're sitting here, looking at satellite and aerial photos and clicking on the boundaries of wetlands and forests, so that when we hear that wetland areas are in rapid decline, we know that because, in large part, somebody took all the time to click on those millions of pictures from satellite and aerial images. So this is not only all of this tedious data annotation is not only a poor use of ecologists' time, it also can delay critical conservation questions so long that the answers aren't useful anymore. If somebody needs to build a road and they commission a wildlife population study to help figure out, well, which path for this road is going to have the least impact on wildlife populations, and then it takes you 2.5 years to get your grad students to annotate all of those images, the data you're providing may no longer really be useful in terms of actually informing policy decisions. And so there is a huge opportunity for machine learning and AI to accelerate this data annotation work that ecologists are tasked with doing and let them spend their time on conservation planning. And so a lot of the work we do in the Microsoft AI for Earth program is focused specifically on this. Let conservationists spend their time on conservation instead of data annotation. And we do that in 3 main areas. One of those is image-based biodiversity surveys, so that's pictures of animals from the ground or from the air. Another one is acoustic surveys of animals, so surveying wildlife populations with microphones, which, by the way, of all the boring types of data to sit and annotate, that is the winner. It is super boring to listen to thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of audio to find the species that you're interested in. And then the third area is the one that Bistra talked about a little bit, which is accelerating landscape ecology workflows from aerial and satellite images. The talk I'm going to give in this session is going to focus mostly on the first part, on image-based wildlife surveys, but all the same story. We want to help all ecologists be more efficient, and so I'm happy to take questions about any of these areas. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We'll open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you. Kindly state your name and affiliation before your question. We have one in the back.
Thanks so much, Brad Plumer with the New York Times. This question is for Professor Bistra Dilkina. It mentioned on the press release that you were going to discuss research about how misaligned priorities between different levels of government can lead to worse biodiversity outcomes. Do you mind talking a little bit about that research?
Yeah, so this is actually an ongoing research project that I'm doing with collaborators from many different institutions. So we are actually looking at how the fact that conservation actions are taken within a governance institution where you might have multiple levels of decision making might be less efficient than needed if this misalignment of priorities is ignored. So like if you think about the federal government allocating conservation dollars across the states and really trying to maximize the effect on endangered species, because that's what the federal government cares most about, versus the specific states looking at their own priorities, which include the endangered species, but also other local species that are of high interest, then how can we do better by providing, again, this kind of decision support algorithms that actually combine that information together to make the best allocation of budgets? And in preliminary results, what we have found is that indeed, if this presence of multi-level decision making is ignored, you can, for example, lose something like 10% of the possible biodiversity impact that you might otherwise get. So what happens is basically you allocate as the top level decision maker, you might allocate your budget expecting some outcome, but then the outcome doesn't happen. You get something less than what you hoped for in terms of like how many species are protected, and it's because the local decision makers did something slightly different than what you expected them to. So like a specific actual case study that shows we don't have that yet. I mean, we have actually we have basically done a study across the U.S. of a hypothetical, like of what will happen if we pretend to be the federal government and we ignore the local states. But I don't have like an actual like, oh, these guys did something that was inefficient. I don't have a specific example.
Question here. Mike is coming.
Thanks. Mark Abrams from Improbable Research. A couple questions for Martin, but you both might have something to say on it. First, are there some species nobody's been able to hook up sensors yet in a reliable way that you're just waiting to be able to get the data from them?
The majority of species, yeah. We have about 800 or 900 that sensors have been put on.
Are there any that you're really, really eager to get because you suspect there's useful information there?
Oh, many, many, many. Because, well, we don't even know yet what they can tell us. But, I mean, if you just think about the species in the oceans, the ones that, seabirds that go across the oceans, the small animals that fly from North to South America, from Europe to Africa, we haven't been able to track. A lot of the land birds, the bats, I mean, there are thousands that we are really, really keen to understand what they're doing.
And the second question, has enough data been able to come in and be analyzed yet? Somebody's been able to begin comparing the information about how the animals are behaving with information about weather and climate patterns and see how one or the other might give a better prediction of what's going to happen to crops?
We know a little bit about that now. I mean, we're working with IBM, checking whether our storks can predict actually the desert locust outbreaks better than anybody else, because they go in these areas, they really sort of peck there, they go to deserts and get the initial instar larvae from the desert locusts. Mundane crops. Well, I mean, you can even the cows or I mean, domestic animals in sub-Saharan Africa, indicating if pests are starting there, swine fever. I mean, there are lots and lots of these examples where we really could rely much better on animals. Avian influenza. I mean, all the zoonotic diseases that animals can tell us immediately when they emerge.
Question in the front here. Thanks.
Mary Miller at the Exploratorium. I have a question for Dan, and it's about the image-based machine learning. Does it also work with video? And can you step us through just briefly how the machines are trained? Because a human could look at a picture of that fox tail and know what it is. A machine may not be able to do that.
Sure. So particularly so a lot of the work we do is specifically around motion-triggered camera traps. That's probably 80% of the work we do, and one of the more common tools for surveying wildlife populations. Video is still kind of new in that space. Really, only in the last couple of years have, partially as a question of power. These cameras have to sit out in the wild for a long time with batteries, and so video is only really now becoming practical. So 99% of our work focuses on stills. There's actually this interesting gray area. If you take like 5 images separated by 1 second, do you call that video, or do you not call that video? But that's the norm. So most of our work is focused on that. And the secret to training machine learning models, and most of my job for about a year, is to call a lot of ecologists on the phone and beg them for their data. And there's just no substitute for that. And like, of course, the academic computer science community will continue to innovate on algorithms, but there is no substitute for lots and lots and lots of data. So actually, the main model we use to help our collaborators in the camera trap space is actually one of the biggest problems that camera trap researchers have is that anywhere from 30% to 99% of the images actually have no animals in them at all. And so while a lot of the glamorous, exciting computer vision is in species classification, we actually focus a lot of our time on just helping people get rid of images that don't have animals in them. That's empties and people and vehicles in a lot of cases if all they are interested in is animals. And so we have collected lots and lots of images that are empty and lots of images that have animals in them. Much of that data we've also been able to make public as a resource for the machine learning community. Obviously not all of it, we don't own that data, but much of it we've been able to make public and contribute back. And so I can tell you about what algorithms we use and what models we use, but really the secret is begging people for their data. And we do that for both this empty, not empty problem and for species classification.
Question in the back?
Thank you. Hi, Megan with IEEE Spectrum. A follow-up question for Martin about the sensors and all the species you haven't yet tagged. Are you developing underwater sensors, like really light sensors for things like bats, things like that? And if so, sort of how far along is the development of that technology?
Yeah, so it took us, unfortunately, much longer than we expected because we have switched to a digital system. So it's a CDMA system, which is IoT, an Internet of Things system, ground to satellite, and there's really nothing out there yet for very small tags. So this will be the first. It's hard to get anything out of the water, so you have to pop up the tags and then send things. But the good thing is we have now circuit boards that are very small, like a gram or so, that are going out to people as an OEM system, so an open source system where whoever can prove that they can work with these can use them and build them into their own systems. Because there are lots of small companies that do wildlife tags. They are specialized for certain aspects. And what we're trying to do is really make this an industrial process. So these circuit boards are really cheap now. They're not handmade like in the old days. And that means that this can really be scaled up and really scaled towards the world.
Okay, great. Question here, and then we'll come over here. Oh, sorry, right here, right there. Sorry. Thanks, Andrea.
Kate Gammon, freelance. Question for Dr. Wikelski. How do the sensors affect the animals? What data is there that it's not harming them or impacting their behavior in such a way that they, are irreparably changed?
That's a really important question. So we are actually in every species that we're using that, testing that in laboratory or in aviary settings. If we see any problem, then we stop the research and develop further. But the key is that we are getting smaller and smaller. That's why we developed this very miniaturized system, so that we are going way beyond these 5% rules. So we're just going, for example, ear tags in an elephant or a lion. It doesn't really affect them much anymore, and they can carry their entire life. And that's what we're aiming at. So we are very concerned about that. We know that every tag affects the animal. We know that. But we think that the benefit we get from that is so much higher that some animals we can sort of ask to carry these tags.
Question in the back, and then we'll come here. Yeah.
This is from the web. This question is from Nicholas Luco from El Mercurio in Santiago, Chile. And this is for Dan. How do you build the database to face recognize the images of animals? What is the limit of smallness? Are you working in plants as well?
There were 3 questions there. There was, I think I'm going to unfortunately have really boring answers to all 3 of those. There's the face recognition question, which is, I think, intended about recognizing individual animals, which for the most part is not what we've worked on at Microsoft, although conveniently, one of the session organizers, Tanya, is is your go-to for precisely that question. And so I don't know if you actually want to take that now or later. I'd say let's talk to Tanya later, because there is lots of amazing work going on in that space, which is in part why that's not what we are actually focusing on specifically in Microsoft, because there's great work that complements exactly what we're doing. If we can help people find the animals, there's great work happening elsewhere that can help people identify individual animals. There was a second question about size, and that is a big issue. In motion-triggered camera traps, we have the luxury that for the most part, if you want to study tiny animals, you don't use motion-triggered camera traps to do that. That is mostly true. So something has to be big enough to trigger the camera, and so that works in our favor in terms of using AI and computer vision. So finding insects in camera trap images is very difficult, but most people, for the most part, don't use them that way. But we do struggle a little bit, and it's still an ongoing challenge for us when occasionally people are using it to study mice, for example. It can be a challenge. And there was a third question.
Plants.
Plants.
Yeah.
So for the most part, again, we are focused on animals, with a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, we're focused on animals. And again, that is consistent with the way people use the sensors that we're helping with. For the most part, one typically deploys motion-triggered camera traps to study animals, and then plants are the reason there's so many empty images in large part. And they can, so for the most part, that's true for the most part of aerial wildlife surveys also.
A question here. Thanks.
Josh Fishman from Scientific American. This is for Martin. You showed a picture of Mount Etna and mentioned volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. Have you found any evidence that animals can predict eruptions and earthquakes?
Yes, but obviously we are very limited in data because you have to be at the right time at the right place to really monitor that. So Etna is a little easier. So during the years we studied, we had 8 major eruptions. So that's our goats predicted that, or would have predicted that. And we didn't do a prediction at the time. We just looked at afterwards. Now we have real-time data. Every 3 minutes we get the data from there. At the earthquakes, it's also difficult because you have to be at a place where an earthquake is happening, and that's very difficult to predict, obviously. So we were lucky that in Italy we went to a place immediately after one earthquake, and the earthquake series stopped and started over again. So we were there before, during, and after. And now we have continuous data. We sort of predicted exactly, luckily, where this next earthquake would happen, a 6.6. So it's one place, one earthquake zone, and we don't know whether this is really scaling towards the rest of the world, but we are testing that now. It is actually hours before, so that's interesting because, and it's consistent with what the USGS knows about when ruptures are about to happen. You have 6.6 earthquake is about 10 by 10 kilometer plates that are sliding off on each other. And they are, before they slide off, they create enormous pressure in the rocks. You get ions into the air, it's ionized air, and that is slowly diffusing. And that's actually giving us, through the animal warning time, between 2 to 12 hours warning time. And that's only in a range of about 20 kilometers. Because that's, supposedly, we don't know the mechanism, but that's the most likely one.
Another question here? Yeah.
About collecting data from dead animals, from smashed dead bugs on the front of trains and buses and things. I know there's a little bit of work about using technology to figure out what bugs were there. Is any of that useful or applying to the work that any of you are doing?
It's super important to understand the dynamics of insects. We don't do that well. Historically, there have been very few data sets that do that, really a decent monitoring on the quantity of insects. There are some studies coming out now. The change in windscreen insects, I don't necessarily know whether that's true because aerodynamics of cars have changed massively, and also how many cars on roads. And okay, yeah. But it's a tricky system. What we do know is that animals that depend on insects are massively declining. So that's, for us, I think, a pretty good sign that there's something really massive going on.
I'll add one thing about another project going at Microsoft. There's insects can also tell us not only about insect populations, but insects that bite things are then carrying DNA that can tell us a lot about the entire ecosystem, not just those insects themselves. So there's an ongoing project at Microsoft called Project Premonition that is using insect capture tools to capture insects, sequence the DNA contained in their blood that can inform us much more broadly about the ecosystem. And this is something we're really excited about as a kind of a new cutting-edge way to... There are some significant deployments underway already, and there's hardware out and rolling. The only reason I'm not dodging the question, I'm actually just not super qualified to give you the details. So, but come to me afterwards, and we'll find out a little more detail. But there is a ton of information online, so it's not like a super secret project. But the general spirit of it is to use mechanical capture of insects and then to sequence the contents of their blood to inform us more broadly about distributions about both pathogens and wildlife out there in the ecosystem.
Question in the back.
Question for Martin. Apart from the earthquake and volcano prediction, which is fascinating, are there other interesting or surprising things about species behavior that you've already observed from using the sensors that wouldn't have been seen or known or found otherwise?
Oh, every day. They do things that we never expected. They cross oceans, they cross mountains. We have birds fly at 8,500 meter altitude. The storks are actually predicting where the next desert locusts are coming out, so this is really exciting. We are getting information on ecosystem services from, for example, bats going across Africa into the Congo. We're finding out how birds actually predict where the next sort of path of a hurricane goes in the Caribbean. So, I mean, every time we look, there's something super exciting about these issues, especially because animals are apparently really communicating with each other and tell us much more about the world than just what they know.
Question in the back.
Hi, Bill Loftus from the University of Idaho. I'm wondering if any of you have connected with New Zealand efforts to eradicate invasive predators that are using AI at this point?
We're working with the guys in Galapagos who actually learned from the New Zealand guys. And that's a very exciting area of application of knowledge of ecology, but also of AI. And I think that has a big future as well.
No, we're not working with them directly. I did mention that one of the important parts of what we do is making data publicly available to get them to make this the work we do more accessible to the machine learning community. And although we didn't work with them directly, one of the data sets we host in our public repository is a data set from a group at Wellington studying exactly that. It's a data set of camera trap images that were put out to study invasive cats.
Bistra, you talked about using AI to help decision makers make small increases in the budget that can lead to these good corridors that help biodiversity. Can you give some examples of cities or places in the country that are really leading the way in doing that kind of thing in their planning?
Well, the system that we looked at is some place where they are actually proactively really trying to do something about connectivity, which is in Montana, where they have some of the largest populations of grizzlies, and there's already huge conservation areas there, and so there you basically already have exactly this situation. You have these big habitat areas that are conserved, but in the middle is areas that are now increasingly urbanized, and agriculture is also taking over. So then actually planning for this kind of connectivity is extremely important if they want those populations to be connected. So definitely the kind of the western states in that area are proactively trying to do connectivity projects.
Since we're in Seattle, the local conservation community is very proud of our I-90 underpass just a few miles east of here. That's been really effective in restoring north-south connectivity in Washington. If you look at the map, I-90 cuts right across the state this way, and that has been historically a challenge for connectivity in Washington, but there are new underpasses going up that have been great success stories both for conservation and for remote sensing.
And maybe to add, animals can actually tell us really well how they want to make these corridors and where they want them.
Right.
So we did a study in Albany on Fisher, and they actually use sometimes other areas that they want to sort of connect. They need their own corridors that they tell us about, which sometimes are much simpler to preserve than and much cheaper than the big things that we usually think about, these big overpasses or so. So asking animals by giving them sort of a voice on the plan is actually a really good thing because it makes things cheaper.
Right, and that's actually some of the synergy. For example, as an input to the kind of like decision-making algorithms I was talking about, the input is first knowing how the animals use the landscape, which, given the characteristics, how likely the animal is to cross it or how hard it is for it to cross a particular like land cover or slope, etc. And so how do we get this data? How well we understand these dynamics is also going to impact how effectively we plan. If our understanding is inaccurate, then even if we optimize our budget as much as we can, it will still not be used effectively if the animals are doing something different. So kind of it's a whole chain of knowledge and that can hopefully all parts of it can be informed by technology to get better and better accuracy in our understanding and better decisions that we do with that with those models and that information.
Can you use AI, Dan, to comb through all of that audio data? You mentioned that it was really difficult to comb through the audio data. What signals are you looking for there? How do you do that?
So this is really a new area for us, but there is an emerging academic community for really doing exactly this. People use audio to study species all over the world, particularly in the marine biology community. People using hydrophone data to study whale calls, for example, is a major area where machine learning can be helpful because it turns out whales aren't calling all the time. And so no matter what you do to try to reduce the amount of that audio, you have a lot of uninteresting audio. A lot of times people are looking for both whale calls and marine traffic, because a lot of the questions people are asking is how is human activity impacting marine mammal populations? And so we've been starting to do a bunch of work in that area to train. Again, while some of the most exciting problems from an academic computer science perspective are in species identification, we're actually really interested in some of the less glamorous problems about just getting rid of all the uninteresting, boring stuff. And even if you can get rid of only 80% of the boring, uninteresting stuff, and people still have a bunch of it left to comb through, if you can make people 10 times more efficient, then that's really what we're trying to do, and that applies equally well to the acoustic space, maybe even more, because it's real boring to listen to empty audio recordings, just like it does in the image space.
And that's again something where the disciplines come together, because we have the same problem on tags, that we can now use the good processors that are available to filter out with AI what we don't need and what we need on the tags. So we want to really sort of understand exactly what the animals are doing and talking to each other, but that means filtering out the rest and also then changing the sensing of the tag in response to what the animal is doing. So it's the position of the animal, the location, the behavior, but also the vocalizations.
Is there room for citizen science in any of this data annotation, or is it all professionally done? Yeah.
That's an excellent question. There's huge involvement already, not just room for, but citizen science plays a huge role in this community area. So specifically in the work we do around camera traps, for example, much of the data that we work with and much of the data we host publicly comes from a platform called Zooniverse that is a citizen science platform for labeling all kinds of images, but all kinds of data, not just images, not just wildlife images, but a huge number of their projects happen to be specifically focused on wildlife-related images and specifically on camera trap images, for example. And that is a huge source of data. And honestly, until we've solved everybody's problems with machine learning, which I admit we haven't yet, it's a huge way to complement the limited resources that ecologists have. So citizen science is definitely already in extremely active use in that particular conservation community.
All right. I think we've reached the end of our questions. So thanks to all of our speakers. That was extremely insightful. And thanks to the media for joining us today. Appreciate it.